Thanks for the introduction, Rosanna. Thank you very much, Mr. Dygan, for launching the report card today, and thank you everyone for attending today. I really appreciate it. Lots of familiar faces. My name's Darren. I'm the TIA Program Manager. I see the day-to-day operations of the TIA program, and today I'm going to give a bit more of an in-depth analysis of the 2022 Tamar Estuary report card. Okay, so what I'm going to cover off specifically, I'm going to give an overview of the Tamar Estuary monitoring that the TIA program undertakes every month. I'm going to give a breakdown of some of the key findings in terms of the key water quality parameters and how they have affected the grades through the zones of the estuary. I'll briefly touch on some of the environmental influences and how that has influenced the grades for this report card. I'll give a specific breakdown by zone for the grades. And then lastly, I'll touch on some of the ongoing monitoring that the TIA program will be focusing on. Okay, as mentioned, this is the 8th report card that has been produced by the TIA program, released every 2 years. The data that we collect on the Tamar Estuary is obviously what feeds into this report card. It's made up of 12 months worth of ambient water quality monitoring data. So the 2022 report card represents water quality from December 2020 through to November 2021. So for the purpose of the report card, we break the estuary up into 5 functional zones, with zones 1 to 3 representing estuarine zones and zones 4 and 5 representing marine zones. We have 16 different monitoring sites along the estuary, starting down just at Kingsbridge outside here, and then we obviously head all the way out to the mouth of the estuary up at Low Head. When we're out there on the boat, we collect a range of physicochemical parameters, including temperature, salinity, pH, dissolved oxygen, turbidity, chlorophyll A, nutrients, and dissolved metals as well. And ultimately, these water quality parameters are compared to default guideline values, which you can treat as thresholds, both upper and lower. Outside of these thresholds represents a fail in terms of water quality, and if they're inside of these default guideline values or thresholds, that represents good water quality. So these parameters are then compiled into a grade type of system, where we then assign a specific grade per zone. So a grade of F represents a fail in terms of water quality, and that's when the water quality parameters fall outside of the default guideline values more than 50% of the time. A grade of D represents poor water quality, which is when the default guideline values or the parameters fall within 50 to 60% of the time. A grade of C is fair water quality, and that is when the water quality parameters fall within the default guideline values 60 to 70% of the time. A grade of B represents good water quality, which is when the default guideline values or the water quality parameters, fall within the default guideline values 70 to 85% of the time. And lastly, excellent water quality condition is when it's above 85% of the time. To the grades themselves, so in Zone 1, we have received for this report card a grade of D representing poor water quality. This is consistent with most other report cards that the TIA program has produced. In Zone 2, we received a grade of C+, which is a half grade decline from the 2020 report card. But again, this is within the range of other reporting periods, which I'll show you on the next slide as well. Zone 3, since monitoring has began, has been the most stable of the zones, receiving a grade of B and is in good water quality condition. This is consistent with the last report card period as well. In Zone 4, we received a grade of B+. This represents a half grade decline from the last report card period in 2020, but overall, a grade of B+ represents the second best score that we have received since we started monitoring, since we started producing these report cards. And that goes for Zone 5 as well, receiving a grade of A-, representing excellent water quality. And again, this is the second highest grade, with the exception of the 2020 report card, in terms of the best grade that we have received since we started producing these report cards. Okay, now I'm just going to touch on some of the major influences that we had seen for the water quality parameters that actually played into the grades. So as I have said, relative to last year, water quality has had relatively minor changes. In terms of the changes to grades, it's only Zone 2, 4 and 5, and they're half grade declines. Some of the major influences that we're seeing. So in the upper and mid estuary, we see that there is a continued high level of nutrients, which tends to drag down the grades, particularly in zone 1 and 2. In the 2020 report card, we've seen improvements to nutrient levels in the lower estuaries, so zone 4 and 5, and dissolved metals as well, and this has been maintained through to this report card period. In terms of dissolved metals, for this report card, it was actually one of the best years across all of the zones, which is great to see. And lastly, for 2 months of the monitoring when we were out there, there was 2 specific months where we had quite low dissolved oxygen levels. And across the estuary throughout the year, we've seen pretty consistent low measures of pH, so quite acidic pH. And I'll touch on some of the reasoning that we, through our analysis, we think have attributed to that specifically. So as I had just mentioned, so pH was quite acidic for this report card period, and there was 2 months where the dissolved oxygen had dropped out quite a bit. So in terms of rainfall for this report card period, if we compare to the last 20 years, it's actually below the median for the catchment. However, since reporting began, this is actually the second highest rainfall year that we've experienced. So that increased level of rainfall across the catchment, obviously running into the Tamar estuary, has increased the amount of freshwater flows, which generally affects the pH of the water, which can make it quite acidic. So based on our analysis, we think that's one of the main attributors that have caused the acidic pH that we have seen in the estuary, and the same goes for the drops in dissolved oxygen in 2 months of the year. We're into zone 1. So as I had mentioned at the start, zone 1 received a grade of poor water quality, which is consistent with most other reporting years. Zone 1 is constantly under pressure from higher levels of nutrients and elevated turbidity, as we are aware. After a pretty significant period of time, we've seen improvements to chlorophyll A, quite significant improvements in this zone, which is great to see. However, these were offset by the more acidic measures of pH, so ultimately the grade has remained the same for this reporting period. And as I had mentioned, dissolved metal concentrations that was first seen to improve in the 2020 report card, those have been maintained through into this report card as well, which is also very good to see. In zone 2, water quality is in fair condition, receiving a grade of C+. This represents a half-grade decline relative to the 2020 report card period. But as I had said earlier, this is well within the range of what we have seen with other report card periods. No surprises here. Similar to zone 1, zone 2 experiences consistent pressures from elevated levels of nutrients, turbidity and chlorophyll A as well. The declining grade for this report card is mostly driven by an increase in the median concentrations of nutrients, and same with zone 1, more acidic measures of pH. And there was those 2 months that we had seen where the dissolved oxygen had dropped out a little bit, which also drove the grade down slightly in this zone. Zone 3 water quality is in good condition. We have seen that Zone 3 has been the most stable of all of the zones since reporting has began. So again, great to see, no surprises here, that we have good water quality up in Zone 3. Of the pressures in this zone, total phosphorus and chlorophyll A are the main ones that tend to impact on what the grade actually is in Zone 3. Nutrients, dissolved metals and dissolved oxygen had minor declines relative to the 2020 report card. But the improvements that we've seen in turbidity and chlorophyll A seem to mediate those negative impacts, and ultimately has led to just a grade of B. Zone 4 also received or scored good in terms of water quality, receiving a grade of B+. For this zone, elevated chlorophyll A and total phosphorus of the nutrients are the main pressures in terms of water quality parameters that actually drive what we see, or the grades that we receive in this zone. The small shift in grade in Zone 4 is primarily driven this year by an increase in the total phosphorus concentrations, more acidic pH, and again, the lower dissolved oxygen in those 2 months through the monitoring period. And this is relative to the 2020 report card period, I should say. Overall, for this zone, this is the second best grade that we have received in Zone 4 since monitoring began, which is great to see. And similar to Zone 3, we actually seen relatively large improvements to turbidity in this zone, which is also very great to see. Zone 5, last but not least, is in excellent water quality condition. So it received a grade of A-, which is a half grade decline from the last report card, the 2020 report card. But as I had mentioned, this is the second best grade that we have seen for the lower estuary for Zone 5, which is brilliant. It continues to benefit from low dissolved metals, turbidity, total nitrogen, and good dissolved oxygen levels. The small shift in grade in this zone is primarily driven by an increase to the median concentrations of total phosphorus and a slight increase in chlorophyll A concentrations as well. In Zone 5, we had higher variability, I should say, in pH. However, again, with the other zones, it is mostly acidic. Okay. Lastly, I just wanted to touch on some of the ongoing monitoring for TIR. Obviously, this is our 14th year this year, 2022, since the TIR program has been out in the water collecting water quality data. Now, as you could see with some of the things I have mentioned here, we're starting to build up a really good picture in terms of what's actually going on in the estuary and being able to reflect on what are the consistent pressures. And moving forward, now that we have this extensive data set, we're going to be able to identify if there are any emerging pressures and be able to provide that to decision makers to make informed decisions, basically, as to how best to manage the estuary. Okay. Lastly, I'd just like to give a massive thank you to the TIR staff. Obviously, they're the ones that are out in the water collecting the data for this program. And I'd like to thank all of our partners. It's great to see so many familiar faces here. I know that a lot of you have had significant input into the development of this report card and assisting us getting this together. We really do appreciate it. The estuary monitoring is actually just one of the components that the TIR program does. It's obviously one of the larger things that we do, and this report card is one of the largest things that we actually deliver. But this estuary monitoring, I think, mostly embolises or best embolises what the TIR program does and what it is. It is a voluntary partnership between responsible agencies to collect evidence for decision makers so that informed decisions can be made. We're about the science within the TIR program, and we couldn't do it without our partners. So I just want to say massive thank you to all of you for being here today and for your contributions to getting this report card together. Thank you.